think we're ready to get started. So hello again, members. I'm Catherine McMacken. I'm the membership manager here at the Henry Ford. And today I'm so happy to welcome you to our next virtual program for members, Women at the Wheel. We're all still a little sad that we can't be motoring through Greenfield Village together for our annual Old Car Festival event. Today's program will be a nod to what would have been our theme, celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the right to vote for many women. And this talk is part of the Henry Ford's virtual series, THF Conversations, where we feature leaders in their fields discussing relevant topics and trends. Each one of these special opportunities is hosted and curated by the Henry Ford's experts and held live on Zoom. So if you enjoy this program, stay tuned for more of THF Conversations, including some special editions created just for you and our member community. And in today's talk, we'll be examining how the early American automobile introduced a generation of women to freedom of mobility, supporting their efforts to make new inroads in the workplace and in civic engagement. We'll find out how car makers marketed to women and the role the car played in the struggle for suffrage. And we are incredibly fortunate that this program is being presented by our own Curator of Transportation, Matt Anderson. And from cars to trains to planes, Matt has always been fascinated by things that move. He's constantly uncovering new stories from within the Henry Ford's transportation collections, and he loves sharing those stories with our members and our guests. Matt is as disappointed as anyone that we aren't all together for Old Car Festival this year, but he welcomes this opportunity to explore our would-have-been theme for 2020, Women at the Wheel. So during the program, please submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many as we can at the end. And as always, to our members, thank you again for your continued support of the Henry Ford. We are all so very grateful that you join us in our commitment to preserving the past and fueling the future. So now I'll hand it over to Matt to take us back to the early automotive era.
Thank you, Kat, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And no, you're absolutely right. I'm feeling a bit melancholy these days, as I was looking so forward to Old Car Festival as I do every year. I love both shows, Motor Muster and Old Car, but I think there's just something even extra special about Old Car Festival because of the Gaslight Parade on Saturday evening, and because the cars just fit so well in the village chronologically in terms of our time period there, going from really the 1890s on up into 1932. And just to rub some salt in the wound, I guess I was looking at the weather forecast, and it looks like other than maybe a little rain overnight on Saturday, we would have had really nice weather too, about 80 degrees both days, and nice skies. But alas, we shall carry on here and try and at least salute the spirit of Old Car Festival through today's program. So with that said, I'm going to get my screen shared here, and we'll start with the program proper. There we go, and hopefully that should be showing up on everyone's screen there, the title slide there. But yes, we're going to look today at our what would have been our theme for this year, which was going to be, as I say, Women at the Wheel. We were looking for an interesting theme, as we do every year, and you know, try and come up with something to keep people interested and excited about what we've got going on. And this year we thought, well, we've got the centennial of the 19th Amendment, which, as it turned out, we just celebrated last month, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago. And we thought, you know, that would be a great kind of hook for the show, a great theme. What if we talked about women at the wheel and talked about how the automobile sort of had an impact on women and early female drivers, how cars were marketed to women and so forth throughout the period we covered at Old Car Festival. So that's what we'll take a look at today as we go through the program. And you'll see here on our first slide, just give you an idea of the outline and what we're going to walk through here. We're going to start by looking at pioneers, a couple of early women who are rather celebrated for their achievements behind the wheel. We're going to look at electric cars, which have a reputation, maybe not an entirely accurate reputation, but nevertheless a reputation for being the women's car of choice in the first couple of decades of American motoring. And whether or not women actually drove them in large numbers, certainly electric automakers marketed to women specifically. So we'll take a look at some of those ads. We also want to look at marketing more generally, particularly with our beloved Ford Model T. We always have many of those at Old Car Festival, always glad to have them. So how was the Model T marketed toward women? And then we'll look at war. In this case, of course, World War I, which had a, as wars often do, had a tremendous impact on social change and women's role behind the wheel. And then suffrage, as Kat mentioned. And that, of course, is our big anniversary this year, the centennial of women gaining the right to vote. And we'll find out the role that the automobile played in that, which I think sometimes is not appreciated as much as perhaps it should be these days. So that should be fun to talk about as well. And then, of course, as we wrap up, there'll be time for questions as well. I'll be happy to answer any questions I can, either about today's presentation or maybe more generally about our automotive collections. So with that said, let's start with, with the very beginning here. This is, the automobile is one of those things where it's tough to assign a specific time, place, or person behind its invention. But a lot of people will point to this vehicle right here. We're looking at a model of it, the 1885 Benz patent motor wagon, built by Carl Benz in 1885, patented in 1886. And they will point to it as being the first motorized vehicle really designed and built around the internal combustion engine. So if you've got to pick a place where the car started, you could do a lot worse than the Benz motor wagon. And we'll talk about Bertha Benz, not just the wife of Carl Benz, but really his business partner in every sense. And she gets credit for sort of helping buck up the company at a time when Carl Benz was losing some faith in the motor wagon's potential. In 1888, she came up with the idea to go off on a long for that time, cross-country trip. She traveled in August of 1888, about 66 miles from dusk to dawn one day throughout the German countryside, in what really was the first long-distance trial of an automobile. And it was a savvy marketing move in addition to just a terrific outing and opportunity for Bertha Benz, because in doing so, she generated some headlines for the Benz patent wagon and kind of got the company turned around and running again. So we certainly have to give her credit for that as being a pioneering woman driver, and as to say, one of the, really the first woman to make a long distance trip. At that point in time, a trip of 5 or 10 miles might have been considered more routine, but here she's going 6 times that far. And I should mention that model we're looking at is in the collections of the Henry Ford, and all of the images and items we're going to look at today are drawn from the Henry Ford's collections, of course. Another pioneering woman who some of you may have heard her name before, but Alice Ramsey, who went on the first woman to take a cross-country trip here in the United States. And you see Alice Ramsey there. She is the second from left in this picture, wearing the duster, the cap, and the goggles around her neck there with a few of her friends. In 1909, she became the first woman to drive coast to coast across the U.S., going from New York City to San Francisco, a distance of about 3,800 miles, and she managed to cover that in 59 days. And it's said that of those 3,800 miles, only 150 of them were actually paved. So most of her time was spent traveling over gravel, dirt, or in poor weather, likely as not mud. Ramsey's husband had bought her a Maxwell car in 1908. Interestingly, her husband had no interest in the car. He didn't drive, but Alice absolutely loved it. In fact, she's said to have put something like 6,000 miles on that car in the first year that she owned it. And she was driving in an endurance race on Long Island there outside New York City when she crossed paths with a publicity agent for the Maxwell Briscoe Company, which would have built that car. And together, the two of them kind of concocted this idea of the cross-country trip. And it would be sponsored by Maxwell. They provided her with a brand new 30-horsepower car for the trip. They also coordinated the publicity, not only in newspapers and magazines of the time, but Maxwell also furnished a pilot car. They had somebody driving ahead of Alice Ramsey, leading the convoy, if you will. They would get into town a few hours before Alice Ramsey arrived, just to let folks know that she was coming in, so the local press could get involved. People could go out and basically greet her at the city limits as she came in. So really a pretty savvy marketing campaign on Maxwell's account as well. And of course, they were hoping to prove that the automobile was no longer a passing fancy. It was, in fact, a new technology that was here to stay. And in the frankly sexist and gendered language of the time, their pitch was, the car is now reliable enough for a woman to drive across the country, which is a little absurd because there's certainly no reason a man would have had any easier time going across country in 1909. The roads, even at that point, were all but non-existent once you got outside of the cities. And certainly, as we mentioned, pavement would have been rare. little Maxwell logo there that's drawn from one of our catalogs in the collection from 1906, as I recall. Maxwell is a kind of a fascinating company. If you know of Jack Benny or ever listened or watched his program, you know he famously drove a Maxwell for many years, not only because it was an old car, out of date. They stopped building Maxwells in the 19-teens, but also because it was an inexpensive car to begin with, and that was a part of Benny's shtick, that he was cheap. So there he is driving this used Maxwell. But the company eventually actually became a part of Chrysler, believe it or not. So there's still a little Maxwell DNA out there today in modern FCA. But let's talk a little bit about electric vehicles. As I mentioned, they tend to be associated with women, or at least the early electrics do. And certainly they were heavily marketed toward women. And there were some reasons for that. And we should remember that electric automobiles weren't really curiosities. They were really viable alternatives to the gasoline-powered car for the first 15 or so years of American motoring. The car's main attributes: they were easy to operate, they were clean, there was no oil, not much grease, no exhaust certainly, and they were very quiet running as well. And those were thought to be particularly ideal or well suited to female drivers, rightly or wrongly. And Columbia certainly plays that up here in this ad, with the woman first dressed in her beautiful white gown, not the kind of thing you would wear in a gasoline-powered automobile. It's also, I should mention, a closed chrome body as well, so she's protected from weather and dirt and so forth there. Columbia is an interesting company. It had its origins in bicycles, and we should mention bicycles are another form of transportation that really paved the way, if you'll pardon the expression, for women's new freedom. The bicycle gave them a degree of independence in the 1890s, being able to ride off, explore on their own, that they previously hadn't really enjoyed, and really set the stage for the automobile. Columbia was the leading producer of bikes in the United States through the 1890s into the early 1900s. And it was the company's founder, Colonel Albert Pope, who decided to get the company into the automobile business, recognizing that this was going to be the new thing, and replace the bike, which it did, at least for a few decades before the bike made its comeback in the mid-20th century. And Pope was building a mix of electric and gasoline vehicles to start with, kind of hedging his bets when he began building them in 1897. And he targeted the wealthy, no question about that, for his electric vehicles. And you see here very clearly in the statement there that the Columbia is a car for electrics, is a car for being for folks who demand the best of everything, right? No question that well-to-do owners are who they're going after here. And in fact, this Brougham sold for about $3,500, so not an inexpensive car. And we'll mention Columbia exited the automobile business in 1913. We'll move into another company that really had its stock in trade in electric vehicles, and that is Baker, founded by Walter C. Baker in Cleveland in 1899. And Baker's first sales pitch was actually heralding the safety of the electric vehicles compared to gasoline-powered cars. In fact, in some of their early marketing, Baker actually described the gasoline-powered cars as explosive motor vehicles. And that was a common pitch, to talk about these little explosions that are taking place inside the cylinders of an internal combustion car, and trying to make people a little uneasy about riding with those explosions. They also said that it was more secure and more reliable than the uncertainties of steam-driven vehicles. And certainly electrics were easier to start and get going than steam vehicles. Of course, their big drawback was always having to wait to fire up the boiler, which could take you 15, 20, even 30 minutes to get it ready. It wasn't until a little later that they had flash boilers, which could be ready in 90 seconds or a minute or so, or 2 minutes, I should say, by the early 1920s or so. But Baker was advertising you didn't have to worry about all that with their electric vehicles. You just flip the switch and off you go. And this ad, I think, again, gets to the idea of affluent buyers there. We see notably, the woman there is at the tiller. She is driving that vehicle, but they're set in a country club setting there. And of course, the man there has his golf clubs. And by the time this ad was published in 1911, Baker offered a full range of cars. They had everything from the low-end starter car, if you will, which would have been about $1,000 for a simple Stanhope, which is the equivalent of a Ford Runabout, just a simple single bench, and not much to it in the way of comfort, creature comforts, all the way up to a $3,500 Brougham, which would be a more formal closed body vehicle like the one we saw in that earlier ad for Columbia. The copy in this ad that you see here really focuses on Baker's record of engineering and achievement, which is typical for automobile ads of that day. They were mostly talking about the vehicle's reliability, its performance, its abilities, and reliability. Those were serious concerns in the first decade of the 20th century. But the illustration here obviously suggests wealth and leisure here, as we mentioned, looking at this country club setting. And here's another ad. This is just kind of interesting. I'll just scroll between them for a second. You'll notice the artwork is different. It's a different car. It's a different couple. It's a different building in the background, but the idea is exactly the same, right? The fellow with his golf clubs, the woman at the controls, this time a steering wheel, not a tiller, and then the country club in the background. So, and no subtlety about it this time in terms of going for wealthy customers. You see right there, the Baker Electric, the aristocrats of motordom. And this ad also, interestingly, in the copy below, tackles one of the electric car's principal drawbacks head on. And that drawback was the limited range, this realization that an electric car, the battery only goes so far before you have to stop and recharge it. So this ad rather diplomatically says that refinements in construction have brought the radius of this car to the point where its dependability upon a charging station has ceased to be a limitation. So just a fancy way of saying this car will take you as far as you need to go. Range in these early electrics was anywhere from 20 to 50 miles between charges, depending on your driving condition. Obviously, if you've got a lot of stop and go traffic, or if you're climbing a lot of hills, you're going to be closer to the 20 than you will the 50 miles in your range. Charging stations were actually fairly easy to find in larger cities at this time, but once you left the city limits, basically forget about it. Electrification of any kind was all but non-existent in rural areas, and that would prove to be a major downfall of the electric vehicle here. The ad also kind of notably says there at the bottom that the car will take you as far as you want to go in a day, as fast as is safe. So again, the speed of these vehicles too is not necessarily all that impressive, maybe 30, 35 miles an hour, but Baker says, well, why would you want to go any faster? So kind of an interesting way to deal with that otherwise drawback. And the ad also notably says that the Baker requires no expert driver or caretaker and no expensive motoring clothes, which were another issue at this time, having to buy the duster, the goggles, the cap to keep your clothes clean in a gasoline vehicle, because you would be splattered inevitably with oil drops. That would not be an issue in the Baker Electric. And I'd like to think they're also maybe suggesting there, because the car doesn't go as fast, you may not be kicking up such clouds of dust as you travel down the roadways. And one more Baker here. Again, no bones about who they're looking to sell to. The social prestige of the Baker Electric here. The car is described here as the result of refined usage by women who want and will pay for the best. And as you read the copy, you'll notice that the words graceful, noiseless, and luxurious all appear in there as well. And once again, looking at a high-end car in this picture, that Baker Brougham, the closed body, would have been about $3,500, which sounds perhaps like a steal to us today, but we have to remember at the time this ad was published in 1910, the average American was making something like $550 a year. So here's a car that cost 6 times as much as your annual salary. So not something the average working Jane is going to be buying. Nevertheless, Baker was America's most popular make of electric car until it was surpassed in 1913 by another company, Detroit Electric, which we'll talk about in a moment. Now, if you've come to Old Car Festival over the years, you know that we always like to set up a special tent there across from Town Hall and bring out something from storage, something that's not usually seen on the floor of the museum. And we had something really special picked out for Old Car Festival. If you would have come to the tent, if we would have been able to do it this year, you would have seen this car, our 1912 Baker Electric Victoria. And it is a car that not only was owned and driven by a woman, it was owned and driven by a famous woman. And in fact, 5 famous women. This car was owned and operated by 5 first ladies of the United States. And we give credit to President William Howard Taft, being the president who motorized the White House in 1909. And Taft, of course, the president, a politician, and he was rather political, I should say, in buying both a White steamer, 2 gas-powered Pierce Arrows, and a Baker Electric. So he covered all his bases with steam, gas, and electric. The president supposedly favored the White steam car, but his wife, First Lady Helen Taft, preferred the Baker Electric. And she did not want to be chauffeured around Washington, D.C. She insisted on driving that car herself. She enjoyed it very much. That first Baker Electric was not this one. It was a 1909 model, but she traded in the 1909 model for this car in 1912. And interestingly, after President Taft left office in 1913, the Bakers stayed behind at the White House. And we'll take a look at some of those other drivers here. Helen Taft there is in your top left corner. I should point out that the Victoria, incidentally, boasted a top speed of somewhere around 30 miles an hour and a range of about 50 miles, again, depending on your driving conditions. But I mentioned when the Tafts left, the car stayed behind, and this little Baker was thereby inherited by Ellen Wilson, the wife of Woodrow Wilson, who we see in the middle on the left here. And Mrs. Wilson sadly passed away while her husband was in office in 1914, and Woodrow Wilson married again to Edith Wilson, who we see here down below at lower left, and she then took over driving duties, if you will, for the Baker Electric. And following President Warren Harding's inauguration in 1921, First Lady Florence Henderson then begins to drive this little Baker Victoria here. And then after President Harding dies in office in 1923, Calvin Coolidge, the vice president, comes into office, and his wife, Grace Coolidge, becomes the driver of the Baker Electric. So all 5 of these women took their turns at the tiller of the Baker. But of course, by the time Mrs. Coolidge is in office there, the car is really outdated, not only in terms of its appearance and its specifications, but frankly, in terms of its propulsion. Electric cars by the mid-1920s are gone. Their history at that point. The gasoline vehicle has established itself, and the electric car won't come back, as we all know, until the early 21st century in a big way. At that point, the little Baker Electric was retired in 1928 and found its way to the Henry Ford shortly thereafter. It's been in our collection ever since, really since the museum opened its doors in 1929. So we really were looking forward to getting this one cleaned up and brought out, put on display in that tent. But who knows? We'll see what we do next year. You may have a chance to see it yet again. We do have another electric car out on the floor of the museum, which many of you probably have seen if you've been through there in our great stories section of Driving America. Originally, it was back in the back area behind our theater experience, and now it's been moved to the far side, if you will, of the railroad equipment as we've taken over some space for the new Driven to Win exhibit. But nevertheless, this is one of our most interesting electric vehicles because it belonged to another famous driver, Mrs. Henry Ford, Clara Ford herself. She did not drive a Model T. She drove a Detroit Electric, of all things. And I should say Detroit Electric evolved out of a carriage company, the Anderson Carriage Company, which had been founded up in Port Huron, Michigan, and relocated to Detroit in 1895. And Anderson built its first electric cars in 1907. And I said this was the company that took over for Baker in 1913 as the best-selling electric car in America. And they continued to build the car basically unchanged in its appearance right through the 1920s. And in fact, they were building electric cars really into the late 30s, though by that point it was really by special order only. So kind of the last of the American electric automakers. But Detroit Electric as well like to advertise that you needn't worry about range. They said that this car will take you farther than you will ever care to travel in a single day. So kind of neatly sidestepping that. Nevertheless, its range was 80 miles between charges, or so the company said, which was quite impressive by the standards of the day. And we mentioned Clara Ford drove this car and not a Model T. She certainly knew how to drive a Model T, and she did drive gasoline-powered cars on several occasions. But for her personal day-to-day transportation, she preferred the Detroit Electric. And our understanding is that she preferred it because it was easier to operate. There were no gears to shift, no crank starting, which was a real issue with the early gasoline-powered cars. You just go and flip the switch and off you go. And she would have used this car while traveling to visit friends or perhaps run errands, both when she lived in Detroit and then later when they moved back to Dearborn to live in Fairlane. In fact, she drove this car into the 1930s, so she certainly held on to it for a number of years. And this is an interesting piece, too, from our archival collections. Apparently, Anderson Electric was not one to miss what they thought was a possible marketing coup. They sent this letter to Clara Ford in 1915 here. And if you look at the letter here, you'll notice that they say here at the bottom, if you would be good enough to let us have the names of some of your friends on the enclosed form, friends who you think might be interested in buying an electric vehicle, we will be happy to reach out to them. So they're basically going to Clara Ford to fish for possible sales contacts or sales leads. So certainly no timidity on the part of Anderson Electric. They went right to her with this letter, no bones about it. And they even included a self-addressed stamped envelope and this little form where she could helpfully fill out the names and addresses. So Anderson Electric could then presumably send sales literature to these possible contacts. We notice the form is still blank, so clearly Mrs. Ford never did fill it out, never did send it back to the Anderson Electric folks. She probably thought that it just didn't make a lot of sense for her to be helping, in a way, a competitor of the Ford Motor Company, though. To be fair, we should say that the Detroit Electric was in a far different price class than the Model T at this time. In fact, I think the Detroit Electric would have sold for something like $3,700, and you could have bought a Model T at that time for about $550. So probably not a lot of crossover in the market, but nevertheless, it makes sense that Clara Ford wouldn't be marketing for them. Another interesting physical artifact in our collection, this is a glass bud vase from anywhere from 1920 to 1940. And this gets to the point that some car makers, particularly gasoline fuel car makers, were trying to appeal to female customers with niceties, like in-car flower vases in the cars. This one is actually from our 1922 Detroit Electric, so you would see them in electric vehicles as well as gasoline-powered vehicles. But you might use silk flowers in this car if you wanted to and not have to worry, of course, about the flowers dying on you. But a lot of folks actually used real flowers and just changed them out every few days. And you could actually think about those fresh flowers as being the earliest example of an air freshener. So instead of the little smelly thing you hang from your rear view mirror, you put in fresh flowers to help offset the smell of the gasoline, the oil fumes, and so forth, which would have been an issue in a car in the early part of the 20th century. So there was a practical reason behind these as well. And that said, we should point out that certainly not just women would have used flowers. Men might have used them for the same reason too. But for whatever reason, a lot of automakers kind of operated in their advertising under this erroneous assumption that women were only interested in the comfort of the car, the appearance, the ease of operation. In the advertiser's mind, only men could possibly care about horsepower and speed. But as we know, that just isn't so. Women were just as interested in power and speed as men were at that time. And automakers realized, though, that even though they thought women and men were interested in different things, I think they operated under an understanding that men might buy the cars, which is to say men might be going in there and paying for them and dealing with the salespeople, but women chose the cars. So the idea was that women had a great deal of influence over their husbands and what kind of car they would get, what kind of speed, what kind of power they wanted, what sort of creature comforts they wanted, whether they needed a big car for the family or a smaller car just for a husband and a wife. So they had to market to women, keeping that in mind as well, that women at the end of the day probably were making the choice as to what car the family would buy. And Ford certainly understood that as well as anyone, and they, among the gasoline-powered automakers, are one of the first to start advertising to women exclusively. We're looking here at a publicity photo essentially taken by Ford in 1914 with a woman at the wheel there of her 1914 Ford Model T. And, the Model T is the car that put the world on wheels, as we like to say. This is the one that shifted the automobile from a plaything for the wealthy to an everyday necessity within the reach of anyone making a good salary, even within the reach of working class folks here. And, women were drawn to the car for the same reasons that men were, because of its durability, because of its low price. And the electric starter, too, also helped draw women toward the automobile. I mentioned, crank starting being a challenge with these early cars, not just for women, but for men. It required a lot of physical effort to get the car started. When the electric starter is introduced by Cadillac in 1912, all of a sudden you can now start a gasoline-powered car with the push of a button or the turn of a key, as it were, without the challenges of crank starting. So that sort of advantage of the electric car disappears. Ford doesn't make the electric starter available until 1919, but still that is pretty fast for the Model T, which after all never really offered much in the way of creature comforts, but they realized the electric starter was something they were going to have to offer. Ford, incidentally, advertised its cars as being easy to drive, and that's a selling point again for both women and men. And we should say, though, that the Model T seems a little confusing to modern drivers because you shift with a floor pedal and your gas pedal is not a gas pedal, it's a stalk on a steering column. But a lot of folks who were going in to drive Model Ts had never driven any car before, so they had no preconceived notions that they had to kind of get over. So it wasn't as much of a challenge as it might be for drivers today. And the Model T did use a planetary transmission, a different setup than the sliding gear transmission that a lot of manufacturers were starting to use by the mid-teens. With the planetary transmission, the gears were always in mesh, so you just pressed the pedal. You didn't run the risk of grinding the gears as you shifted between them. So indeed, it was easier to drive by the standards of the day. Ford actually appealed directly to women starting about 1915 with this little sales pamphlet called The Woman and the Ford. And this is a car that really, or the language rather in this pamphlet really positions the car, the Model T, as a vehicle for social change, if you'll pardon the forced pun there. The language really talks about the Model T emancipating women from their traditional domestic roles at that time. I should say that progressive language within the pamphlet really isn't reflective of Henry Ford's own views at that time. Ford, in fact, said one of his reasons for introducing the $5 a day in 1914 was because he was worried about wives having to take jobs in order to help support the family. He thought, unfortunately, that women belonged in the home. So by offering the $5 a day, people could afford to do that. So just because the pamphlet's forward-looking doesn't mean that Mr. Ford himself was at the time. But let's just take a look inside this pamphlet. It really is an interesting piece. And I should say the whole thing has been digitized and put into our online collection. So if you go into our collections page and just search The Women and the Ford, this will pull right up and you can read the whole thing. But some fun bits to highlight here. That second paragraph on the first page there, talking about the happy change that the car is bringing for women. It's broadened her horizon, increased her pleasures, given new vigor to her body, and made neighbors of her faraway friends, and multiplied tremendously her range of activity. And this is maybe the most interesting sentence in the whole thing. It is a real weapon in the changing order. The Model T is driving this social change as women start to get more involved in civic affairs and start taking jobs outside the home. On the other side, just interesting that Ford notes that more women drive Ford cars than any other car in the world. And I think it's probably safe to say that they said that knowing that more drivers, period, drove Ford cars than any other car in the world because Ford was selling in larger numbers than any other car in the world. After all, by the late teens, half of all the cars on American roads were Model Ts. So again, a safe bet that more women were driving Fords than anything else. Oh, and a couple of other interesting pages here. I've highlighted this section here. The Ford is the first car to use the left side drive, having the driver sit on the left side of the car versus the right side. And that's a question I get asked often. Why is it that drivers sit on the left side in the United States? And it's largely because we drive on the right side. And this paragraph kind of gets to that point, saying that the left side drive is a particular blessing to women because it adds to the safety of driving and best of all makes it possible for the driver to step directly to the sidewalk or the curb without the necessity of plowing through the dust or mud of the street. So the idea is that in typical cars, the woman might be riding as a passenger. You could drop her off right on the curb because she can open up the door and get out there. With the Model T, even if she was driving, she would still have to exit out the right-hand side because Model Ts at this point did not have a driver's side door. They only had a right side or passenger side door. So that was a convenience. But again, not just for women. That would have been convenient for anyone behind the wheel. And one more little bit here, and again, you'll have to forgive the rather sexist language of the day there, but it says here, there must be women with checkbooks, and in parentheses, or access to their husbands, who love the outdoor life, who crave exercise and excitement, who long for relief from the monotony of social and household duties, and who have said, again, a sexist note here, I wish I were a man. And here they're just telling women who own the Model T, why don't you tell them that your motor car is a solution to all of their troubles? So certainly a little bit of over-salesmanship there, suggesting the Model T will solve all of these problems. And we'll jump to another Ford ad here from about a decade later. This is from 1924. And we're looking at an ad not just for a Model T, but a closed Model T. And I want to use this to get to a point here. Really for the automobile's first 20 years or so, open touring cars were the standard, cars with the open tops, the folding tops. That's just what everyone drove. And in fact, in those early years, open air riding was often thought of as a part of the attraction of motoring, this idea of driving with the wind in your air, kind of exposed to the wind and the weather. It was a part of the fun, the pleasure of the experience. And drivers and passengers, they just dealt with the bad weather, whether it was wearing waterproof clothing in the rain or wearing lap robes or blankets in the cold weather. It was just a part of the thing, part of the deal. Closed cars were available by the mid-1910s, but they usually cost hundreds of dollars more than their open car counterparts. So to put it in perspective, that could be a third or even a half, again, as much as the price of an open car, so fairly expensive. And that attitude really starts to change with the Essex Motor Company, which would become a part of the Hudson Motor Company. Essex started pricing their coupes in the early 1920s, or the closed cars, closer to the price for the open cars. And surprise, surprise, when the price came more in reach of the open car, they quickly discovered that customers preferred the closed car. They liked that protection. Go figure that they wanted to stay warm and dry in the bad weather. And these closed cars were initially marketed as being particularly helpful to women drivers. And we're seeing that in this Ford ad right here, saying that, that makes the ride far more comfortable. Again, getting to this idea that women were most concerned with comfort in the car. But again, that doesn't make much sense to me in the modern day, because I would imagine most men preferred staying warm and dry in bad weather as well. But such were the attitudes of the day. And just to show you how quickly the shift from closed cars to open cars took place, I've got two numbers here. You see the sales, or the production figures rather, in the United States and Canada. You've got 1922 there on the left, you've got 1929 on the right, and the red color there represents the number of open cars that were sold, and the blue, the number of closed cars that were sold. So as you look there, in 1922, there was something like 1.3 million open cars and 529,000 closed cars. You go 7 years later, not only has the production of cars generally increased by leaps and bounds, but you see clearly the number of closed cars has soared above the number of open cars. They're selling something like 436 open cars versus 3.3 million closed models. So it's a funny thing, in the space of less than 10 years, we go from the open car being standard to the closed car being standard. We also go from the open car being less expensive to the closed car being less expensive. And that's where we still are today. Now the open car, the convertible, costs you more money, and it's considered more of a premium product. So it's funny how that worked, but traces its origins here to the 1920s. Looking at another Ford Model T ad here, this one from 1926. This is an ad. These ads were run in magazines that would have typically appealed to women readers. So you see here the Ladies' Home Journal ran this one. And Ford makes the classic appeal to vanity in this ad. Why are women so enthusiastic about the Ford car, it asks? Well, because it's a car of which you can be genuinely proud. And they also add here that it's unusually easy to drive and easy to park. And it brings complete relief from worry. In other words, a low maintenance vehicle here. And we should say that coupe and sedan prices on the Model T here range from anywhere from $580 to $660. So the closed cars on the Model T would have cost you in the neighborhood of $600. Open cars at this time for the Model T still cost only $380. So while Essex was marking its closed cars a little closer in price to its open cars, the Model T pretty much always kept the closed cars as a less expensive option the open cars as a less expensive option than the closed cars. And I think that's simply because that was the Model T's target market. They were going for the budget-conscious consumer. So there were people who were interested in a less expensive car, whatever it took. And if it was an open car, so be it. So the Model T, as I see, never really shifted like that. That's something you saw more with the Model A. Another interesting point in this ad here, or the ads of this time, which we'll look at here in the next one. And we see here the woman getting out of, again, a closed Model T, and boy, hinting at that idea of social change again, an open door to wider contacts. We see the progressive themes of the woman in the Ford once more. And the point, though, isn't so much that the Model T allows the woman to go out and do all of these things. If you actually read the copy, you'll notice there that it allows the woman to do more every day, but still keep pace with their usual schedule of domestic obligations. So again, it's assuming that the woman is still in the home. The car just allows her to go out, visit friends, run errands, and still have time to do all of the cooking, the cleaning, and all that sort of thing that she was expected to do. So progressive on the surface, not so much when you dig down deep into it. But that other detail I was mentioning is actually almost buried here in the third paragraph, where they talk about the Model T as being a desirable car, either alone or to supplement other cars. So that's maybe a little surprising that even as early as 1925, the idea of families buying not just one car, but a second car is already prevalent. So just, again, speaks to how quickly and fully the automobile was embraced by American consumers. And I have to go to one more ad here, and this is not a Ford ad, but this is one of the most influential automobile ads, frankly, one of the most influential ads of any kind of all time. And, well, Ford ads and most ads from other car makers into the 1920s were straightforward and practical. They focused on the car's reliability, its price, its performance, those kinds of by-the-books details. This ad appeals to emotion. This is an ad from the Jordan Motor Car Company, founded by Ned Jordan. And Ned Jordan's greatest contribution, certainly to the automotive industry, is not so much the cars he built, but the advertising copy that he wrote. He wrote most of the company's ads personally. Jordans, we should say, were built in Cleveland, and they weren't so much as they were assembled. These were what we would call assembled cars. Ned Jordan sourced his parts from outside suppliers and then put them together. But to be fair, he went to the very best. So his cars were always built of the best components and designed to kind of give you the look and feel of an expensive custom car without necessarily being as expensive as you would have thought. And Jordan's most celebrated model was the Playboy, which was really a sports car before that term was in general use. A little two-seat roadster, open top, a car that you would buy and drive purely for the fun of it here. And that is indeed what this ad is for, Jordan Playboy, and this ad referred to as Somewhere West of Laramie. And you can read the copy yourself there, but somewhere west of Laramie, there's a bronco-busting, steer-roping girl who knows what I'm talking about. She can tell what a sassy pony that's what a cross between greased lightning and the place where it hits can do with 1,100 pounds of steel in action when he's going high, wide, and handsome. And the bottom line there, the money line, if you will, the truth is the Jordan Playboy was built for her. So, a couple of main points here. Again, nothing about the car's cost, nothing about horsepower, nothing about speed, just a pure appeal to emotion, the spirit that the car would evoke, the sort of pleasure it can bring you. And the other big point, that they're not treating women in this ad as being unusual. Women drivers aren't seen as something distinct or different as they are in most ads. Women are treated equally. This is a car, in fact, that they say is built for women. There's no reason they wouldn't enjoy driving as much as men would. So really a striking ad, an important one to feature here today. I mentioned we would talk a little bit about the war, and certainly, as we say, wars have a way of spurring drastic changes, economic change, technological change, and social change. And World War I, the Great War, was certainly no exception. And women kind of found themselves in a new role in World War I they'd never been in before. They had always traditionally been making sacrifices on the home front during the war and using their talents and their skills to support soldiers from well behind the front lines, often still at the home front. But with World War I, they were now allowed to combine those sort of traditional activities of self-sacrifice with their new talents behind the wheel. And the Motor Corps, or in fact, a series of different motor corps were established around the United States, which recruited some 12,000 women to drive service vehicles on the American home front. The thought being that a lot of the young men were off overseas fighting on the Western Front, so women could then kind of pick up the slack, if you will, and drive transport vehicles. Some of them drove troop transports, some of them drove supply trucks across the country from base to base, keeping the wheels, if you will, moving on the home front in the war effort. Women, we should say, also stepped into men's roles in driving buses and taxis and things like that in the cities. So they were really stepping up to the front on a number of different areas here. And some of the women driving in the motor cars, particularly the ones that were moving troops from place to place, they would often drive their own personal cars. So they were, in a sense, donating those to the war effort as well. But of those 12,000 women that were involved in the motor corps around the country, maybe the most noteworthy or the most remembered today are the 300 or so women that actually traveled overseas to the war front to drive ambulances for the Red Cross. And we're looking at some of those women here posing in front of a Ford Model T ambulance at the Highland Park plant. Ford donated $500,000 to the Red Cross early in the war, and the Red Cross in turn used that money to purchase about 1,000 Ford vehicles. Of those 1,000 vehicles, about 107 of them were ambulances like the one we're seeing here. Ford produced another 5,700 or so ambulances during the war for the Allied armies, not just for the Red Cross. And we should point out too, Ford designed these vehicles while working closely with the U.S. Surgeon General's office and frontline ambulance drivers themselves. So women like this were actually having some input in how these vehicles should be designed and how they should be operated. So no better source than going to the folks who have to drive these things every day. And I suppose I should say too, women weren't, of course, just driving these cars, both on the home front and on the battlefront. They were also responsible for maintaining them and for repairing them. So they were developing mechanical skills or improving mechanical skills they already had. And finally, we want to talk a little bit about the automobile's role in suffrage. And we've got an interesting ad here. This is not a vintage ad from the 19-teens, obviously. It's from 1952. But it's looking at a 1914 Dodge up there and showing it being used by a suffragist there. And the automobile really obviously gave suffragists transportation. It allowed them to move to rural areas, to move freely in spreading their message about women and the fight for the vote. But they also gave them a mobile platform from which to speak. Essentially, it's a podium. You drive up, the woman stands up there on the floorboard in the back seat, and she's got, in effect, a makeshift stage from which she can address the gathered crowd there. And not only that, but the automobile also gave women a lot of surface area to decorate the car with signs, with banners, with placards. In effect, they turned the cars into parade floats that they can drive either singly or more often in convoys into towns and basically set up an instant suffrage women's rights parade right there and draw more attention to their struggle, to their fight. And, the car, of course, had advantages over other ways of transportation. Women were traveling by streetcar at this time and by interurban car to kind of spread the message and fight for suffrage. But, of course, they could only go where the rails took them. With the automobile, they could go to increasingly more remote hamlets. And this ad from 52 is from the Ethel Corporation, who produced an anti-knock compound for gasoline. And they were sort of illustrating, again, this idea of a woman giving a speech from a 1914 Dodge there. We have tried to pay tribute to the car's role in suffrage, and if you've been through With Liberty and Justice for All, you'll probably recognize this vignette. In this case, our car is a 1913 Model T being used. And again, you see how it's decorated with bunting, with banners, anything that might catch the eye and draw attention to the car and to the speaker on the car here. Really, the Illinois Equal Suffrage Association gets credit for being the first to realize the potential of the automobile. In 1910, they organized a series of automobile tours across the state of Illinois, promoting the struggle for women's rights. And the advantages were obvious from that point on. So other folks started to use the automobile, other suffragist groups working across the country, with the notable exception of New York City, where automobiles were still thought of as being sort of a plaything for the wealthy. Of course, New York, famous for its public transportation, which it had in the teens just as it had it today. So the car wasn't a necessity there in the way it was in other American cities. So suffragists were a little worried about those associations. They thought women would think that suffrage was only something for well-to-do women. But the Model T helps to break that barrier because it does, again, put the car within the means of working class folks. So it helps erase that stigma over time. So it's appropriate. We should have a Model T here in our setting. And this little vignette here isn't the only thing we have in our collection. Obviously, the signs in here and the banners are all replicas for the exhibit, but we have some original pieces here too. And you're looking here at a hood ornament from about 1910. The message, very clear, very prominent, votes for women. And there's not only that message there on the front, this is actually built with a couple of sockets on the side, so you could put a couple of flags in there too. Again, anything that creates movement, color, and draws your attention to the car, and by extension to the cause. And I'll pause here to point out, this photo was taken by our talented photography team long before I joined the museum, but I can't take credit for it, but nevertheless, I was extremely pleased the other day when I was counting up the stars on those flags. Those are 48-star flags, as they should be for the mid-19-teens. And then one more item here in our collection. This is a felt pennant from about 1915 for votes for women. And again, the kind of thing that women might carry in a parade or might mount onto the vehicle to draw attention to the cause. And once women secured the right to vote, which they did in 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment, we should point out the car didn't entirely disappear from the story. It continued to serve the cause for women's suffrage, as these women's groups were using cars to drive people to the local offices to register to vote, and then, of course, later to drive them to the polls in order to cast their vote. So the car continues to play a role. But there's no question that in the early 20th century, the automobile really gave American women a new sense of freedom. And in this case, it's not just literal freedom in the sense of being able to travel where they wanted on their own schedule when they wanted, but also sort of a figurative sense of freedom too. It is a part of the effort to liberate them from traditional domestic spheres. And needless to say, that work continued well through the 20th century and continues today, sorry to say, to some extent as well, as women try to overcome some of the unfortunate stereotypes that have evolved in marketing. I have noticed automotive marketing now is getting to be more fair, though. If you look at ads, and it's a little beyond the scope of our talk today, but even ads produced as recently as 10 or 15 years ago can still trade in some of those old gender tropes or stereotypes. So we've still got a ways to go, but my gosh, I'd like to think that automakers have begun to realize that women actually do enjoy driving. They are gearheads as much as men. So by all means, they should be a part of that conversation, a part of that marketing effort. And I wanted to wrap up with some resources here for additional reading, if you're curious, which hopefully you are. And I'll start with a couple that are on our own website. And I think we're going to try and share these links in the chat box here as well, so you can go right to them if you'd like to after the talk. We have an expert set on our collections page, which we call Electric Cars for Well-to-Do Women. And it features a few of the ads that I showed today, as well as other ads and other artifacts from our collection, showing again how electric cars were marketed to women, particularly wealthy women in the 19-teens. And then we have a blog post that was just written a couple of weeks ago by my colleague Sage Jedley, and it's a wonderful blog post on the automobile and women's suffrage. She looks specifically at how the car was used to help spread the message for women's rights to vote and the success in achieving that goal. So well worth your time to read that. And then, of course, you should visit the museum if you haven't already. Probably most of you have, but always worth another visit to With Liberty and Justice for All, where we talk about women's suffrage. That is one of our core stories in that exhibit. You can see that Model T in person when you do that. And a couple of other sources beyond what we have at the Henry Ford, a couple of books for further reading, which we do have actually in our library, but might be worth checking out yourself if you want to pick up a copy. The first, particularly well suited for the Old Car Festival time period, is by Virginia Scharf, and it's Taking the Wheel, Women in the Coming of the Motor Age. And this book really explores the first 30 years or so of motoring, from about 1900 right up into 1930. It's a beautifully organized book, talks about all these topics: the fight for suffrage, the World War I effort, and marketing to women as well. And say a little older, from 1991, but still fascinating. And sadly, even though this book was published now 30 years ago, there hasn't been a whole lot like it published since. So we really are overdue for further scholarship on this topic. The other book, more recent, published in 2017, Women at the Wheel, nice title there, by Catherine Parkin. You see Women at the Wheel, Century of Buying, Driving, and Fixing Cars. And I would say the primary difference between these two books is that, well, the Scharf book is about the early years, just the first 30 years or so. Women at the Wheel is really about the whole of the 20th century into the 21st century. And the Parkin book really takes on the topic in a different approach. It's talking about marketing right on through the 20th century. It's talking about women and women's car clubs, talking about women and their experiences with sexism behind the wheel, and experiences not only as drivers but also as passengers. So even a little broader social history than what you see in Taking the Wheel. But both books certainly worth checking out. And again, I wish there's more. There's certainly room for more scholarship on this topic. With that said, I'll open it up to questions here, and I will stop my screen share and turn on my video here.
Thank you, Matt. This was such a wonderful program. Thank you for digging into this era with us and sharing all this great information from our collections.
My pleasure, absolutely.
Great. And thank you, members. There's been several kind comments in the chat about how much folks enjoyed the program so far, so that's wonderful. And we have a number of questions that have come in as well. I thought the first one we would start with is one from David, just to kind of continue your recommendations for further reading. And he's asking, do you have any particular recommendations for literature on marketing to women by auto companies? He's particularly interested in Packard.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not aware of anything specifically written, about Packards in general, but your best study for women and marketing in the automobile is certainly that second book we looked at, Women at the Wheel by Catherine Parkin, she's got an extensive chapter about that. And the nice thing about that book, she also reproduces a lot of the ads, so you can see them for yourself. And it's interesting, it's not only about how the cars were marketed toward women, but frankly about how women were used in some of those advertisements to reach men. And you can let your imaginations wander about that and sort of think about how that might have been done over the years. Needless to say, though, not necessarily with a lot of sensitivity to women and to gender issues, but it's a great book, well worth looking at.
Great, thank you. Another kind of maybe resource question or just general question, Dennis asks, was there any marketing toward people or especially women of color?
No, I have not seen any marketing specifically toward women of color, not in our collection or other pieces I've had. And that's not to say that it didn't happen. I'd like to think that it did, but they're probably, given the standards of the day, unfortunately, I doubt there were much effort spent on that. But that's a topic too that's far, far overdue for further study. I'm not aware of any books that have been published on people of color or African Americans, specifically in their experiences with the automobile. And needless to say, they've had a very different experience with the automobile than other folks have. So it's a topic that someone desperately needs to do some work on.
Absolutely. Next, another question from Dennis. The pioneer women drivers like Alice Ramsey were good mechanics, especially during the endurance races. Did women in this time period own and operate auto repair shops?
Oh, that's a great question. And no, I have not seen. I have to believe that somewhere certainly women did. There got to be cases of it. I haven't read of any of them, and would think in the Sharp book it would have mentioned them if there had been some. So perhaps there are some that just haven't been discovered or that significance hasn't been realized yet. That said, undoubtedly too, there were women who worked in the garage as a family business, who probably worked right alongside their husband and learned those skills too. And certainly some women who came back from World War I with new experiences and new expertise in mechanics. Some of them may have gone into that business as well. But no, that's a great question. Certainly worthy of further exploration.
Absolutely. And another question here from Mark. He asks, what role did cars play in helping women break into the workforce? He was thinking specifically with businesses like Mary Kay.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah, and traveling salespeople in general, whether they were women or men, are one of the earliest sort of target markets for the automobile and some of the earliest adopters, if you will, of the automobile. Because they, time is money for anyone, but especially for a traveling salesperson, and they couldn't afford to be tied to railroad schedules or railroad routes for that matter. So the automobile allowed them to travel to different places. And the Sharp book actually talks a little bit about this and about how women enjoyed, not the salespeople necessarily, but the women at home enjoyed when women selling for cosmetic products or whatever it might be would come to visit. Because if you're a woman living isolated in a rural community, it's nice to have someone come by and open up their home. So they developed sort of relationships and sales opportunities, frankly, too, from that. So.
Very cool. Next, Jill asks, she says, I noticed an offering of an Edison battery or lead battery in an electric car ad. I'm reading the book Edison right now, and I'm wondering if THF has one on display to see.
So I'm trying to think, if we have one, it would be in the Made in America exhibit. I don't believe, we don't have an Edison automotive battery on display. I can say that much for sure, but we do have some. And in fact, we've got an Edison built electric automobile. It was one that he built actually in the late 1880s, 1889, I think. And he built it first as kind of an experiment around what he could do with his batteries, how he could improve them, then put it on the shelf for a number of years, brought it back out. And if you read the Edison book, I assume it's the Edmund Morris book, there's a bit in there where he talks about Edison getting back into the automotive battery business in the early 19-teens. And unfortunately, he doesn't have a great deal of success with it, but he brings that car back out and uses it as a test platform for his battery. So we do have that, and there are some of his original batteries with it. But yeah, unfortunately, not on the floor right now of the museum.
Got it, thank you. Next, Robert asks, what year did car insurance come to the scene?
That's a great question. I unfortunately cannot give you a specific year for that, but earlier than we all might think. Certainly by the aughts, the first decade of the 20th century, the 19-teens, car insurance would have been an available product. And initially it would have been more about, I think, theft and damage necessarily than it would have been about accident protection. But fairly early on, for that matter, driver licenses and registrations were earlier than we might think too. I think the earliest ones were 1898, 1899. So
Wow.
very early, we realized that we had to get some kind of a control on all these automobiles before it got out of hand.
Absolutely. And we're just about at our 6 o'clock, so we'll make this the last question. Shirley asks, if we get to have Old Car Festival next year, could we still redo the theme of women at the wheel?
I like that idea. I was really looking forward to doing this. Not only would we have the Baker Electric out there, but we had all kinds of vignettes and programs in mind. We were going to reproduce some ads, even do a passenger review with some of the cars that were marketed toward women. So let's just say we're going to consider that and see if we can make that happen for 21.
Excellent. Well, thank you again, Matt, for this wonderful program. And thank you to our members for joining us this afternoon to give a nod to Old Car Festival. And we look forward to seeing you at our next virtual programs.